Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you all are safe, healthy and happy. In this video, we're going to talk about anatomy of tongue. So let's start with its objectives, which are the following: external features, mucous membrane, muscles, blood supply, nerve supply, lymphatic drainage and development. So let's start with its external features. It has the following three features, namely the root, tip and body. Root is the posterior part of the tongue which is attached to the mandible and hyoid bone by muscles. It is due to this attachment why tongue is not swallowed during deglutition. Tip is the anterior free end of the tongue which touches the central incisors at rest. Next is the body. Body is nothing but the bulk of the tongue and it has the following surfaces. That is the dorsal surface and the ventral surface. This dorsal surface is divided into two by a V-shaped sulcus terminalis, namely the oral or the anterior 2/3 part and the pharyngeal or the posterior 1/3 part. Now let's talk about the mucous membrane. Mucous membrane of the oral part of the dorsal surface is moist, velvety and has numerous papillae, whereas the pharyngeal part is devoid of papillae and is irregular due to numerous lymphatic follicles called the lingual tonsil. In this picture, you can see that the oral surface has various papillae due to which it appears velvety and moist, whereas the pharyngeal part is devoid of papillae and appears irregular due to numerous lymphatic follicles. On the other hand, the mucous membrane of the ventral surface is thin, smooth and purplish, and it has the following three features, namely the frenulum linguae, which is the fold of mucous membrane that runs from the base of the tongue to the tip. Further extension of this frenulum linguae leads to a condition called tongue tie, which can be only corrected surgically through cutting the frenulum linguae. Next feature is the deep lingual vein, which runs laterally along the either side of the frenulum linguae. Next is the plica fimbriata, which is a fringed fimbriated fold of mucous membrane running laterally to the deep lingual vein. Now let's move on to the papillae of tongue in detail. There are four kinds of papillae, namely circumvallate, filiform, fusiform and foliate. This foliate papillae is rudimentary in humans, that is, it is imperfectly formed. Now let's start with circumvallate papillae. It is the largest, 8 to 12 in number, and along the margins of the sulcus terminalis. In this diagram you can see that it opens into sulcus and there is presence of taste buds on either side of the papillae. Next is the filiform papillae. Filiform papillae is the most numerous and the narrowest, spread along the dorsum of tongue. In this picture you can see that this papillae is pointed and conical, and it is this papillae which gives the velvety appearance to the tongue. Next is the fungiform papillae, which is round and appears as pink pinheads along the margins of the tongue. So now let's move on to the muscles, which are of two types, namely the intrinsic and the extrinsic muscle. Intrinsic muscle changes the shape of the tongue, while the extrinsic helps in its movement. This picture is the coronal section of the tongue, which shows the following muscles: superior longitudinal muscle, inferior longitudinal muscle, transverse and vertical muscle, which are the intrinsic muscle. The extrinsic muscles are the following: the genioglossus, hyoglossus, styloglossus and palatoglossus, which is not visible in this diagram. This is a median fibrous raphe which divides the tongue into two. So starting with intrinsic muscle, the superior longitudinal muscle is present just below the mucous membrane, whereas the inferior longitudinal muscle is present between the genioglossus and the hyoglossus muscles. The transverse muscle extends between the median fibrous raphe to the margin of the tongue. The vertical muscle is present along the anterior part of the tongue. Now let's talk about the extrinsic muscle in detail. As you can see, this is the genioglossus muscle, which is a fan-shaped muscle radiates from the superior genial tubercle to the whole of the tongue and a part of hyoid bone, which forms a fan-shaped structure. So next is the hyoglossus muscle. It is the quadrilateral shaped muscle which arises from the greater cornea of hyoid bone to the side of the tongue. Next is the styloglossus muscle which arises from the styloid process to the side of the tongue. Next is the palatoglossus. This muscle arises from the palatine aponeurosis and inserts into the side of the tongue. Now we move on to the arterial supply, which is via 4 arteries. 2 arteries being the branches of lingual artery, that is the deep lingual artery in the anterior part and the dorsal lingual artery supplying the posterior part of the tongue. The rest 2 is the tonsillar branch of facial artery and ascending pharyngeal artery, which are the branches of external carotid artery. Next is the venous drainage. Venous drainage is via 3 veins, the most important being the deep lingual vein, the principal vein. The next 2 veins are the venae commitans accompanying the hypoglossal nerve, the venae commitans accompanying the lingual artery. Venae commitans is nothing but a pair of veins along the hypoglossal nerve or the lingual artery. These join together to form lingual vein, which ultimately drains into the internal jugular vein. This union occurs in the posterior border of hyoglossus muscle. Next we move on to the lymphatic drainage of tongue. It is via 4 vessels, namely the apical, marginal, central and basal. The apical vessels drain the tip of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. The marginal vessels drain the margin of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. The central vessels drain the central portion of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, whereas the basal vessels drain the posterior part of the tongue. These vessels drain into 4 types of lymph nodes, mainly the submental, submandibular, deep cervical lymph node and jugulo-digastric lymph nodes. The apical vessels drain into the submental lymph node. The marginal vessels drain into the submandibular lymph node. The central vessels drain into the deep cervical lymph node, whereas the basal vessels drain into the jugulo-digastric nodes and the upper cervical lymph nodes. Now we move on to the nerve supply. Under motor supply, all the muscles are supplied by hypoglossal except palatoglossus muscle, which is supplied by vagus nerve. Under sensory supply, the anterior two-thirds of the tongue is supplied by lingual nerve, which carries general sensation, and cauda tympani nerve, which carries special sensation. The posterior one-third of the tongue is supplied by glossopharyngeal nerve. The posterior most part of the tongue is supplied by internal laryngeal nerve. Now we move on to its development. The muscles of the tongue is developed by occipital myotomes. The anterior two-thirds of the tongue develops from fusion of lateral lingual swellings with tubercular impart of the second pharyngeal arch. The posterior one-third part of the tongue develops from the cranial part of hypobranchial eminence of third pharyngeal arch. This hypobranchial eminence has 2 parts, namely the cranial and the caudal part. This cranial part of hypobranchial eminence of third pharyngeal arch eventually fuses with the anterior two-thirds part of the tongue. This union is marked by sulcus terminalis, which is also the origin of thyroglossal duct during embryo stage. The posterior most part of the tongue develops from the caudal part of hypobranchial eminence. So this is it. This brings me to the end of my video. I hope you liked it, and if you did, please like, share and subscribe. Comment below if you have any worries or doubts. Thank you and bye bye for now.